Before I tell you this story, I need you to understand something. Some folks spend their whole lives searching for a place to belong. They wander through cities and towns, through homes and relationships, always looking for that one thing that makes them feel whole. But me, I stopped looking a long time ago. I convinced myself that being alone was safer than being hurt again. I built walls around my heart so high and so thick that I forgot there was even a heart underneath all that stone. My name is Cole Harding, and this is the story of how a deadly blizzard, two Apache sisters, and a love I never expected changed everything I thought I knew about life, about family, and about myself. If you have ever felt invisible, if you have ever wondered whether anyone in this world truly sees you, then stay with me. Because what happened to me on that frozen Wyoming night might just give you hope that even the loneliest soul can find their way home. Now, hit that subscribe button and settle in. Hit that subscribe button. This story is going to take some time to tell, but I promise you, it is worth every minute. The sky over the Wyoming territory turned the color of old pewter as evening crept in, heavy with the warning of a storm that had no mercy in it. The wind came first, slicing across the open land like a blade, carrying dust, dead grass, and the sharp scent of snow that had not yet fallen. I sat on my horse Willow on a ridge above a narrow creek, my hat pulled low and my collar turned up against the cold. I was only 23 years old that winter, but hardship has a way of aging a man faster than years ever could. I had lived alone on my 200 acres since I was 18. That was the year fever took my mama, and a horse fall took my papa the winter after. Just like that, I went from being a boy with a family to being a man with nothing but land and silence. Folks in town called me strange. They whispered that I was quiet, touched by ghosts maybe. I rarely spoke unless business required it. I kept to myself, kept my head down, kept my heart locked up tight. That was the only way I knew how to survive. My small herd of cattle huddled by the creek that evening, their breath visible in the dropping temperature. I counted them twice, then a third time just to be sure. 32 head, not much to build a future on, but it was all I had in this world. The land was stubborn, rocky in some places, swampy in others. It fought me every single day, and I fought it right back. That land was my only companion most nights. Some men might have found that pathetic. I found it honest. A low rumble rolled across the ground, and I stiffened in my saddle. That sound was not thunder. It was wind. Deep, angry wind that signaled the kind of blizzard that swallowed up whole families and barns and left nothing but bones behind come spring. I knew the signs all too well. The stillness in the air, the metallic taste on my tongue, the sudden silence of birds that should have been settling in for the night. Every instinct I had screamed at me to move. "We are in trouble now," I muttered, patting Willow's neck. She snorted nervously beneath me, sensing the danger long before I fully understood it. That mare was smarter than most people I knew. She had never led me wrong. I needed to move the cattle to the lower valley, where the hills curved just right and gave some protection from the worst of the cold. But as I started driving them forward, the storm arrived faster than any storm had a right to. The snow did not fall. It attacked. It hit like fists, angry, stinging fists that blinded me, soaked me, and froze my face within seconds. Willow stumbled beneath me, and I leaned low over her neck, urging her forward, but I could barely see my own hands in front of my face. The world vanished into white. White sky, white ground, white wind that screamed in my ears until I could not hear my own thoughts. My fingers went numb first, then my toes, then something deeper inside my chest. A cold that had nothing to do with temperature. Willow fought to keep her footing, but the drifts grew higher by the minute, and the wind grew stronger until I could not tell if we were going north, south, or straight into the arms of death itself. "Easy, girl," I whispered, though my voice barely carried over the screaming wind. "Easy now." I tried turning back toward the ranch, but I had lost all sense of direction. I could have been 10 feet from my barn door, and I would not have known it. The white swallowed everything. Every landmark, every hope, every prayer I might have offered if I had been a praying man. Panic clawed up my throat, sharp and bitter. I had faced hard times before. I had buried both my parents before I was old enough to vote. I had survived droughts and bad winters and loneliness that felt like it might crush my chest some nights. But this was different. This storm wanted to kill me, and it was doing a fine job of it. Not like this, I thought desperately. Not alone in the snow, not without ever knowing what it felt like to be close to someone, not without ever really living at all. Willow suddenly jerked her head up, snorted loud, and forced her body forward against the wind with a determination I did not expect. She smelled something wrong, something warm, something alive out there in all that deadly white. Go on, girl, I said, giving her her head completely. Take us there. I trusted that horse more than I trusted my own frozen senses. She had gotten me through rough spots before, but never anything like this. Still, I had no other choice. It was follow her instincts or die where I sat. She carried me forward through drifts that reached her belly, fighting the wind with every step. And then I saw it, a dim flicker through the storm. At first, I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me, a dying man's last vision of warmth before the cold took him for good. But the light grew stronger as we got closer. Warmer, real, fire. Fire meant shelter, and shelter meant people. I slid off Willow and half stumbled, half fell through the deep snow toward that light. It came from a tall, cone-shaped shelter tucked into a natural break in the rock. A teepee. Smoke curled from the top of it, and animal hides covered the entrance, glowing orange from the fire burning inside. For a long moment, I just stood there staring, too cold to think clearly. Then my father's voice echoed in my mind, sharp and clear despite the howling wind. His words from when I was just a boy. Do not trust them, son. They take kindness and give back steel. He had been talking about Indians. He had never had a kind word to say about the native people who had lived on this land long before any white man ever set foot here. I grew up hearing those warnings, those fears, those prejudices passed down like heirlooms from generation to generation. But the cold was already giving steel to my bones. Ice formed on my eyelashes. My fingers had stopped hurting, which meant they were close to being damaged beyond repair. If I stayed outside much longer, I would die before Willow finished her next breath. Fear of the storm outweighed every old warning my father had ever given me. I forced my numb hand forward and knocked against the wooden support pole beside the hide flap entrance. The sound was weak, pathetic, the knock of a man barely clinging to life. Hello, I croaked through frozen lips. I am lost in the storm. Please, I mean no harm. For a long, terrible moment, nothing happened. The wind screamed around me. The snow tried to bury me where I stood. I thought maybe no one was home. Maybe the fire was left burning in an empty shelter. Maybe I was going to die on this doorstep after all. Then the flap moved, and my whole life changed forever. A young woman stood there in the entrance, framed by the golden firelight behind her. Her eyes were dark and steady, watching me with an expression I could not read. Her hair was long and black as a raven's wing, braided neatly over one shoulder. She could not have been older than 20 years, but there was a strength in her gaze that made her seem ancient and wise beyond her years. She studied me the way you might study a wounded animal, trying to decide if it was dangerous or just desperate. Behind her, another woman rose from beside the fire. This one was older by a couple of years, stronger in her stance, with the same striking features. Sisters. I could see the resemblance in the shape of their faces, the set of their shoulders, the way they both watched me with identical caution. I did not need to see their eyes flick toward the rifle resting near the fire to know they saw me as a potential threat. A white man stumbling out of a blizzard, half frozen and desperate. They had every reason to be suspicious, every reason to turn me away and let the storm finish what it had started. But I was not a threat. I was just a half-dead rancher who needed help more than he had ever needed anything in his entire life. Please, I said again, my breath shaking, my whole body trembling. My horse. She is freezing out here. I mean you no harm. I swear it on my mama's grave. The two sisters exchanged a quick, quiet look, having a conversation without words in the way that only family can do. Then the younger one nodded, her expression softening just slightly. Come, she said. Her voice was accented but sure, every word pronounced with careful precision. Bring your horse. Storm kills fast. They came out with me into that screaming white nightmare, showing me where to tie Willow in a small, sheltered crease beside the rocks. When my frozen fingers could not manage the knots, the older sister stepped in silently, and tied them herself with practiced ease. She did not say a word. She did not need to. Her actions spoke louder than any speech could have. Inside the teepee, the heat hit me so hard I almost collapsed right there on the buffalo robes that covered the ground. The shelter smelled like smoke and leather and herbs I could not name. A pot of something hot simmered by the fire, sending up steam that made my frozen face sting. I stood there dripping melted snow, shivering so hard my teeth rattled in my skull. "Sit," the younger woman said, pointing to a spot near the fire. "Before you fall." I sank down onto the furs, hardly aware of anything except the glorious pain of warmth returning to my frozen limbs. My fingers burned, my toes screamed, but it was the good kind of pain, the kind that meant I was still alive. "I am Cole Harding," I managed to say through chattering teeth. "My ranch is somewhere south of here. Got caught in the storm." "I am Leia," the younger woman said. "This is my sister, Ta, the older one." She nodded at me but did not speak, her eyes still watchful and wary. I did not blame her one bit. If two strange Apache women had stumbled onto my property in the middle of the night, I probably would have been suspicious too. They gave me a blanket made of some kind of soft animal hide, and they gave me hot tea that burned my throat and healed me at the same time. They gave me silence that was neither hostile nor welcoming, just watchful, waiting to see what kind of man I really was beneath all that frost and desperation. As my body slowly thawed and my mind started working again, I could not help thinking how strange this whole situation was. I had spent 5 years avoiding every soul in the territory. I had built my whole life around being alone, around needing no one, around keeping every person at arm's length. Now here I sat, half frozen, inside a teepee with two Apache sisters who had every reason to fear and hate men who looked like me. They should have turned me away. They should have let the storm take me. That would have been the safe choice, the smart choice. Instead, they had saved my life. A complete stranger, an intruder, a white man. Why, I found myself asking before I could stop the words. Why help me? I could not finish the question. I did not know how to put into words what I was really asking. Why save me when your people have been hurt by people who look like me? Why show kindness when you have probably seen so little of it from my kind? Leia looked at me with dark eyes that seemed to see right through all my walls, right down to the lonely, scared boy hiding underneath the man. "Storm does not care what color your skin is," she said quietly. "Cold kills all the same." I swallowed hard around the lump in my throat. Such simple words, such profound truth. The storm did not care about the color of my skin or the history between our peoples, or the fear and hatred that had been drilled into me since childhood. The storm just wanted to kill anything in its path, and these two women had chosen mercy over caution. They had chosen humanity over history. I did not know what to say. I was not used to kindness. I was not used to anyone caring whether I lived or died. For 5 long years, I had been invisible. Just the strange, quiet rancher that nobody talked to unless they needed something. The ghost who lived on the edge of town. "You are different now," Ta said suddenly, speaking for the first time. Her voice was deeper than her sister's, rougher around the edges. Eyes before were empty, now they looked scared. "I am scared," I admitted. It was the most honest thing I had said to another person in years. That storm nearly took everything from me. "Storm takes many things," Leia said, "but it brings things too. Sometimes bad, sometimes good." She looked at me with something that might have been compassion, or maybe just curiosity. I could not tell. But whatever it was, it made my chest feel warm in a way that had nothing to do with the fire. The wind howled outside, shaking the teepee walls. But inside, I felt safer than I had in years. The fire crackled. The sisters moved around the shelter with quiet efficiency, preparing food and checking the entrance flap, and tending to small tasks that kept their home running. I watched them work, grateful and exhausted and confused all at once. "How long have you lived here?" I asked eventually. "2 winters," Ta answered. She handed me a bowl of stew that smelled like heaven and tasted even better. "Our family was taken. Soldiers forced them to reservation far from here. Many died there. We escaped. Came here instead." Her words were matter of fact, but I could hear the pain underneath them. The loss, the anger that she kept carefully controlled. These two young women had lost everything, just like I had. But while I had retreated into loneliness and self-pity, they had built a life for themselves out here in the wilderness. They had survived. They had thrived. They had created a home out of nothing but determination and skill. That is dangerous, I said quietly. Two women alone out here. Ta raised one eyebrow at me in a look that could have cut glass. Dangerous for who? Despite everything? Despite the cold still in my bones and the fear still in my heart, I almost smiled. These women were not helpless. They were not victims. They were survivors, just like me, maybe even stronger than me. I should rest, I said, suddenly aware of how heavy my eyelids had become. The warmth and the food were pulling me down towards sleep. But I will leave in the morning, soon as the storm passes. Sleep, Leia said gently. Morning will come when it comes. I lay down on the furs near the fire, wrapped in blankets that smelled like smoke and sage. Outside, the storm raged on, trying to tear the world apart. But inside that teepee, surrounded by the quiet presence of two strangers who had saved my life, I felt something I had not felt in 5 long years. I felt like maybe I was not completely alone in this world after all. I woke to a stillness so complete it felt unnatural. The storm that had tried to kill me had passed, leaving behind a pale muted light that filtered through the smoke hole at the top of the teepee. The fire had burned low, glowing like buried embers beneath gray ash. My body ached from head to toe, every muscle protesting as I slowly sat up and tried to remember where I was. Then I saw Laia kneeling by the entrance, repairing a tear in one of the hide coverings with careful stitches, and everything came flooding back. The blizzard, the desperate ride through white nothing, the light in the darkness that had saved my life. She did not look up from her work, but somehow I knew she was aware of every movement I made. There was a stillness to her, a quiet awareness that reminded me of a deer listening for danger. Not nervous, just alert, always ready. Ta entered moments later, pushing aside the hide flap and bringing a gust of cold air with her ear. She carried an armful of wood in her arms, snow dusting her dark hair and shoulders. She moved with the confident stride of someone who had faced hard winters before and won. "Storm gone," she announced, brushing snow from her sleeves. "Your horse is well. She ate from our stores." The relief that washed through me was almost overwhelming. Willow was more than just a horse to me. She was my only real companion, the only living thing that seemed to care whether I came home at night. "I should check on my cattle," I said, though my voice came out uncertain and rough. "I need to get back to my ranch. See how much the storm took from me." Leia looked up from her stitching then, her dark eyes steady and calm. "Eat first. Long ride in snow on empty stomach is foolish." She was right, of course. My stomach growled loudly, reminding me that I had not eaten anything since yesterday morning. But there was something else too, something beyond practical wisdom in her words. A gentleness that I was not used to receiving from anyone. She handed me a carved wooden bowl filled with something that looked simple but smelled rich with meat and herbs. My stomach growled again, louder this time. I took a bite. It was warm and earthy and comforting, like being wrapped in a blanket from the inside out. "This is good," I said, meaning every word. Ta gave a small smirk from across the fire. "Better than the dried beans you eat alone every night." I blinked in surprise. "How did you know about that?" She shrugged one shoulder. "We see far." I did not know if that meant they had watched me from a distance at some point, or if they had simply guessed based on my appearance. Either way, they were not wrong. Most nights I ate whatever I could cook fast without effort or care. Beans straight from the can. Hardtack that was more rock than bread. Food that kept me alive, but did nothing to make living feel worthwhile. I had been existing, not living. Going through the motions of each day without any real purpose or joy. The sisters watched me eat in comfortable silence. When I finished and set down the empty bowl, Leia spoke again. "You live alone?" she asked. "No wife, no family?" I nodded slowly. "For 5 years now. Lost my mama to fever. Lost my papa to a horse fall. The ranch is all I have left in this world." I expected pity. That was what most people offered when they heard my story. That uncomfortable look of sympathy that never quite reached their eyes. Words that were supposed to comfort, but always felt hollow. Instead, I got something different, something real. Our family taken too, Leia said softly. Soldiers came, forced them onto reservation many days a ride from here. Many got sick there. Many died. We escaped before the sickness could take us too. I looked between the two sisters with new eyes. Two young women alone in a land full of men who would see them as prey or as enemies. That was dangerous in ways I could barely comprehend. At least when people saw me, they saw a white man, a landowner, someone with rights under the law. When people saw Leia and Ta, they saw something else entirely. Something to be feared. Something to be controlled. Something less than human. The injustice of it twisted in my gut like a knife. That must have been hard, I said quietly. Losing everyone like that. Ta studied me for a long moment, her eyes sharp and assessing. Hard, she agreed, but we survive. That is what matters. Surviving. I understood that better than she could know. Survival had been my whole existence for 5 years. Just getting through each day. Just keeping the ranch running. Just staying alive for one more sunrise without really knowing why. But sitting there in that teepee, warm and fed and surrounded by people for the first time in longer than I could remember, I started to wonder if maybe there was more to life than just surviving. Maybe there was something better out there. Something worth actually living for. They invited me outside after I finished eating. The world had transformed overnight into something beautiful and terrible. Snow blanketed everything as far as the eye could see, sparkling in the morning sun like millions of tiny diamonds scattered across the land. The air was sharp and clean, gentle compared to the storm's rage from the night before. Everything looked new, reborn. Their camp was cleverly hidden between rock formations, the teepee positioned just right to block the worst of the north wind. A small spring bubbled nearby, steam rising from the warm water like breath from a sleeping animal. They had chosen this spot with skill and wisdom. Anyone passing by would never know they were here. You built all this yourselves, I asked, genuinely impressed by what I saw. Apache women build homes, Ta said with obvious pride. Men hunt. Women keep life going. That is the way it has always been. I had known some ranchers back in town who could not even fix a simple door hinge without making a mess of things. These two women had built a fortress out of nothing but their own two hands and their determination to survive. Leia pointed to a small structure half hidden by brush near the edge of their camp. Food cache, she explained. We keep meat and supplies safe from animals there. Bears cannot reach it. Ta showed me herbs growing near the warm spring, naming each one in both English and her native tongue. Each plant had a specific purpose. Some for healing wounds, some for flavoring food, some for medicine when sickness came. Some even had storytelling traditions tied to them, passed down through generations. I found myself leaning closer, nodding like a schoolboy trying to absorb everything at once. I had never been much interested in learning before. School had felt like a prison when I was young, and after my parents died, there was no one left to teach me anything except the land itself. But listening to Leia and Ta share their knowledge felt different. It felt like being invited into something sacred. You listen well, Leia said approvingly. Her eyes met mine and held there for a moment longer than necessary. Never had anyone worth listening to before, I admitted honestly. Her expression softened in a way that made my heart beat faster in my chest. A flutter I had not felt in years, a warmth that had nothing to do with the sun shining down on the snow. Then Ta suddenly stiffened beside me. Her whole body went rigid, her gaze shooting toward the distant ridge like a hawk spotting prey. Riders, she whispered, her voice gone cold and hard. 3 of them, coming this way. I squinted against the glare of sun on snow and saw the silhouettes she meant. 3 mounted figures moving across the snowy plain, heading straight for the valley where we stood. My stomach dropped like a stone. I know that coat, I said grimly. That is Jim Price from the ranch north of mine, and I recognized the others too, which meant trouble was riding straight toward us. Trouble I was not sure I could stop. Ta's hand moved instantly to the knife at her belt, her fingers wrapping around the handle with the ease of long practice. Leia stepped closer to me without thinking, her body tense and ready. I could feel the fear radiating off both of them, carefully controlled, but definitely present. They had survived this long by staying hidden. by avoiding contact with white settlers who would see them as trespassers at best and targets at worst. Now 3 armed men were riding straight toward their home, and there was nowhere to run. "You stay inside," Ta ordered, her voice sharp. "They see us. Trouble comes, big trouble." "No," I said quickly, surprising myself with how certain I sounded. "Let me talk to them first. They know me from town. They will not start shooting if I am standing right here." The sisters exchanged one of those quick, silent looks that seemed to communicate whole conversations in a single glance. Then Leia nodded once, her dark eyes holding mine. "We trust you," she said simply. Those 3 small words hit me harder than the blizzard ever had. Trust. When was the last time anyone had trusted me with anything? When was the last time I had been worthy of anyone's trust? I stepped out into the open, waving my arms over my head to draw attention before the riders got too close to the teepee. My heart pounded against my ribs, so hard I thought they might crack. I was not a brave man. I had spent 5 years running away from every human connection possible. But something about those 2 sisters made me want to be braver than I had ever been before. Jim Price reined in his horse when he spotted me, his weathered face showing surprise beneath his wide-brimmed hat. His son Billy rode beside him, barely 20 years old, and trying hard to look tough. But it was the 3rd rider who made my blood run cold. Davis Cobb. Mean as a starving coyote and twice as unpredictable. He was the kind of man who enjoyed hurting things smaller than himself. The kind of man who looked for any excuse to cause pain. I had crossed paths with him in town a few times and learned quickly to give him a wide berth. "Cole," Jim called out as they drew closer. "We thought the storm took you, boy. Whole town was betting on whether we would find your frozen carcass come spring." "Nearly did take me," I said, forcing my voice to stay casual and steady. "But I found shelter just in time. Got lucky." Billy squinted past me toward the rocks, his eyes narrow with suspicion. "Shelter where?" "Ain't nothing out here but empty land and rocks. Nearest homestead is 10 miles east." I kept my expression blank, my body positioned between the riders and the teepee hidden in the rocks behind me. "I will show you the spot another time. Right now I need to get back to my herd." Storm scattered them something fierce. Going to take me days to round them all up again. Davis spat a stream of brown tobacco juice into the pristine white snow, leaving an ugly stain on the perfect surface. His eyes had a mean glint in them that I did not like one bit. "You sure you were not shacked up with some squaws?" he asked, his voice dripping with ugly insinuation. "Heard there are savages hiding out in these hills. Couple of young ones who escaped the reservation. Pretty little things, from what I hear." That word hit me like a slap across the face. Squaws. The hatred behind it, the casual cruelty, made my stomach turn. Cold fury rose up inside me, unfamiliar and sharp and impossible to ignore. "You watch your mouth, Davis," I said, my voice low and dangerous. I barely recognized myself. Davis smirked like a man who knew exactly what buttons he was pushing and enjoyed every second of it. "What? It ain't like they belong out here anyway. Should be back on the reservation where the government put them. Living like wild animals in the hills, it ain't natural. Someone ought to round them up and take them back where they belong." The sound of a rifle being cocked cut through the cold air like a crack of breaking ice. I turned my head just enough to see Ta standing on a rock outcropping above us, rifle aimed straight at Davis's chest. Her eyes were steady and unblinking, without a trace of fear or hesitation. She looked like she had done this before, like she would not hesitate to pull that trigger if the situation required it. Jim Price went pale under his winter tan, his hand moving slowly toward his own weapon. "Easy now, miss. Put that down. Nobody here is looking for trouble." "She started it," I said, pointing at Davis. "He came onto their land making threats." "Their land?" Davis laughed, an ugly sound that grated on my nerves. "Since when do savages own land? Since when do they have rights that a white man is bound to respect? This is all our land, Cole. Every inch of it." I took a step forward, positioning myself even more firmly between the riders and Ta with her rifle. Something had shifted inside me. Something that had been sleeping for 5 years was suddenly wide awake and ready to fight. "They saved my life," I said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I was dying in that blizzard, frozen solid and lost. They took me in when they did not have to. They fed me. They gave me shelter. They did not ask who I was or where I came from or what color my skin was. They just helped a stranger in need. That is more than I can say for most folks in town who have known me my whole life. Silence fell over the group. Jim Price studied me with a long, measuring look, like he was seeing me for the first time. Billy shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. Even Davis seemed thrown off by the heat in my words. Then another horse appeared on the ridge behind them, coming fast. Sheriff Randall rode into the clearing, his tin star glinting in the morning sun. He must have followed the tracks from town, probably looking for survivors of the storm just like Jim had been. His weapon was already drawn, aimed directly at Davis Cobb. "That is enough," the sheriff barked, his voice carrying authority that brooked no argument. "I have been watching from the ridge. These women have not broken any laws that I can see. They have a right to be here, same as anyone else. And Cole Harding is a better man than you ever were, Davis Cobb." Davis sputtered, his face going red with fury. But even he was not stupid enough to argue with a man holding a drawn pistol. "Let us go," Jim said quietly to his son. "This does not concern us. Storm has everyone on edge. Best we just move on and forget this happened." He turned his horse and rode away without another word. Billy followed close behind, casting one last curious look back at the teepee. Davis glared at me with pure hatred burning in his eyes, a look that promised this was not over. "This ain't finished," he said under his breath, so quiet only I could hear. "You picked the wrong side, Harding. You are going to regret that." Then he too rode off, following the others back toward town. When their shapes had finally disappeared over the ridge, I let out the breath I had been holding. My hands were shaking. My whole body felt like it might collapse. I was not built for confrontation. I was not built for standing up to men like Davis Cobb, but I had done it anyway. For Laya, for Ta, for two women who deserved better than the hatred this world wanted to give them. Ta climbed down from her rock perch slowly, the rifle still cradled in her arms. She looked at me with something new in her eyes. Not quite warmth, but maybe respect. Maybe the beginning of trust. "You stood for us," she said. Her voice was steady, but there was a hint of surprise beneath the surface. "You could have said nothing. Could have let them search. You protected us instead." Laya appeared from the shadows of the rocks, moving toward me with quick, graceful steps. Her hands were trembling as they reached up to touch my face, checking for injury, making sure I was real and whole. "You foolish man," she whispered. "You could have been shot. Could have been killed. For us? For strangers you barely know?" I caught her hands in mine, holding them gently against my chest where my heart was still pounding fast. "For you," I said quietly, "I would face worse than Davis Cobb." Ta crossed her arms over her chest, blinking rapidly like she was trying to hide emotions she did not want to show. "We stand together," she declared. "All of us. From now on, that is the only way any of us survive." And in that moment, standing in the snow with these two remarkable women who had shown me what courage truly looked like, I knew she was absolutely right. I barely slept that night back at my ranch. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw Laya's soft smile in the firelight. I saw Ta's fierce stance on the rocks with that rifle aimed steady and true. I saw the trust in their eyes when they had let me speak for them. A trust I had done nothing to deserve. By dawn, I had made a decision that felt equal parts reckless and right. I loaded my pack horse with supplies I could spare from my own meager stores. Flour and dried meat, a bag of coffee beans that I had been saving for a special occasion that never seemed to come, a spare wool blanket that was old but still warm, and after several long moments of hesitation, a small tin of sugar. I did not know if the sisters liked their tea sweet, but something in me wanted to bring them a small kindness they might not expect. The ride to their hidden valley felt quicker this time. My heart pulled me forward faster than Willow's hooves could carry me. When the teepee finally came into view, tucked safely between its protective rocks, a weight I had not even realized I was carrying lifted off my chest. They were still there, still safe. Leia emerged from the shelter first, as if she had been watching for my approach. Her eyes widened when she saw the supplies loaded on my pack horse, then softened with something that looked like relief, or maybe gratitude, or maybe something else entirely that I was too afraid to name. "You came back," she said quietly. "I was not sure you would." "I said I would," I replied, suddenly nervous for reasons I could not explain. I brought some things to repay your kindness from the storm. Ta stepped out of the teepee behind her sister, arms crossed over her chest. But there was a hint of approval in her dark eyes that had not been there before. Maybe you stay for food, she suggested. Your stories make Laya laugh. We do not hear enough laughter out here. Laya elbowed her sister in the ribs, her cheeks warming to a pretty shade of rose. Ta just smirked and disappeared back inside, leaving us alone in the cold morning air. I stayed for food that morning, and then I stayed through the afternoon, helping them repair some winter damage to their shelter. And then I stayed until the moon began to rise, sharing stories by the fire about my parents and my ranch, and the town that had never really felt like home. That day marked the beginning of a new rhythm in my life. I rode to their valley 3 times a week at first, then 4 times. Some visits I brought supplies that they needed, nails and rope, fabric for patching clothes, herbs from town that did not grow wild in these parts. Other visits I brought nothing but myself, my company, my growing need to be near them. They taught me things I had never thought to learn. Laya showed me how to identify healing plants by their leaves and stems. She explained which herbs could reduce fever and which could clean a wound. Ta taught me hunting tricks that her father had taught her when she was just a girl, how to read animal tracks in the snow, how to move through the forest without making a sound, how to shoot with accuracy even in poor light. In return, I shared what little wisdom I possessed. I taught them ranching skills that might help them survive if they ever found themselves near cattle, how to mend fences quickly, how to tell when a storm was coming by the shape of clouds on the horizon, how to find water underground by reading the color of the grass. We were teaching each other, learning from each other, building something between us that felt more important than just survival. One afternoon when Ta had gone to check on some snares she had set in the woods, I found myself alone with Laya by the fire. She was trying to teach me how to work with beads, creating patterns that held meaning in her culture. My fingers were clumsy and thick, made for ropes and reins rather than delicate work. Our hands brushed together as she guided my movements, once, twice, a third time that felt too deliberate to be accident. Each small touch sent jolts of electricity through my skin, warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. I tried to focus on the beads. I failed miserably. You are different now, Leia said softly, breaking the comfortable silence between us. Different how? I asked, not meeting her eyes. Before, when you first came to us in the storm, your eyes were empty, like windows to an abandoned house. Now they look alive. Now they look like someone is home. I swallowed hard around the lump that had formed in my throat. Maybe I did not have much worth living for before, just the ranch, just the cattle, just getting through each day without remembering how alone I really was. And now, her voice was barely a whisper, close enough that I could smell the sage smoke in her hair, close enough that I could count her eyelashes if I wanted to. Now there is something, I said carefully. Now there is someone. Her breath caught, a small sound that meant everything. A smile tugged at the corners of her lips, small and shy and more precious than all the gold in the California hills. Ta returned a few minutes later with 2 rabbits for dinner. I pretended that nothing had happened. I pretended that my heart was not beating itself out of my chest. I pretended that I was still the lonely rancher who needed nothing from anyone. But inside, something had changed. Something had cracked open that I had kept locked away for 5 long years. I was falling for Laya, falling hard and fast and completely out of control. And for the first time in my life, the falling did not feel like dying. It felt like flying. Winter slowly loosened its grip on the land as the weeks passed. The snow began to thin. Animals stirred early from their winter dens. Green started to appear beneath the white. Spring was coming, bringing change with it like it always did. I knew the sisters would need to move with the new season, follow the patterns their people had followed for generations, move north to better hunting grounds, leave this valley that had become a second home to me. One morning I arrived to find their belongings already neatly organized and packed, hide bundles stacked near the entrance, dried food supplies ready for travel, everything positioned for a journey. My heart dropped into my boots so fast I almost stumbled. You are leaving, I said. My voice sounded small and lost even to my own ears. Soon, Ta confirmed. She did not look at me when she said it. But not far. I blinked, not understanding. Not far. Laya stepped closer to me, her dark eyes holding mine with an intensity that made my breath catch. There is a sheltered valley 2 miles from your ranch, she said softly. Good land, hidden, safe. We will stay there for spring, be close enough to see your smoke, close enough that I could reach them in minutes if trouble came, close enough that this thing growing between us could keep growing, close enough for something like hope to take root in my chest for the first time in 5 years. You are staying near me? I managed to ask. Staying close? If you want that, Leia whispered. Want. The word did not even begin to cover what I was feeling. I wanted it more than I had ever wanted anything in my entire miserable, lonely life. I nodded, unable to speak, around the emotion rising in my throat like a spring flood. That night, I helped them pack up their camp and move to the new location. We traveled through narrow ravines and hidden rock cuts that I never would have found on my own. They knew this land better than I knew my own ranch. The new valley was beautiful. A bend in the creek provided fresh water. Tall rocks on 3 sides gave protection from wind and prying eyes. Grass was already starting to grow green in patches where the snow had melted. It was close to my ranch, close to me. And once they had settled into their new home, something shifted between Laya and me. Something unspoken but understood. Something that had been building since the night as she opened that teepee flap and let a frozen stranger inside. Spring arrived in full force over the following weeks. The fields around my ranch burst into color as wildflowers pushed through the softening earth. Birds returned from their winter travels, filling the air with songs that sounded like celebration. The whole world felt new and fresh and full of possibility. My cattle had survived the winter better than expected. Only lost 3 head to the storm instead of the 10 I had feared. The creek was running high with snowmelt, giving them plenty of water. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to feel something like optimism about the future. But my thoughts kept drifting to the hidden valley, to Laya. One evening after finishing my chores early, I saddled Willow and rode to the sisters' new camp. Ta was busy smoking fish near the creek, her practiced hands moving with efficient grace. She nodded at me when I arrived, but did not stop her work. Laya is by the water, she said without looking up, downstream, through the willows. Was that a hint of a smile on her face? I could not be sure. Ta was harder to read than any book I had ever tried to puzzle through. I found Leia sitting on a flat rock beside the creek, her bare feet dangling in the cold water. The evening light caught her hair, making it shine like polished obsidian. She looked peaceful, content, beautiful in a way that stole the breath right out of my lungs. She looked up when she heard my approach, and her whole face transformed with a smile that made my knees go weak. Cole, you came. Every day if you would let me, I thought, but did not say out loud. I sat down beside her on the rock, close enough that our shoulders almost touched. The creek gurgled over stones, singing its endless song. Somewhere in the willows, a bird called out to its mate. It is beautiful here, I said, because I needed to say something, and the truth was always easier than trying to be clever. Yes, Leia agreed. This land has been good to us. Given us shelter when we needed it, food when we were hungry, and now, she paused, glancing at me from the corner of her eye. Now it has given us a friend. Is that what I am, I asked? Just a friend? The words came out before I could stop them. Too bold, too forward. I felt heat rush to my face and prepared myself for rejection. But Laya did not look offended. She looked thoughtful, considering. I do not know what you are, she admitted softly. I have never met anyone like you. A white man who sees us as people, who protects us, who comes back again and again even when there is nothing here for him. There is everything here for me, I said quietly. More than I have had anywhere else in 5 years. More than I thought I would ever have again. She turned to face me fully, her dark eyes searching my face like she was looking for something. Some truth hidden beneath my words. Some proof that I meant what I was saying. Cole, she whispered, why do you come here so much? The question hung in the air between us, heavy with meaning. I could have lied, could have made some excuse about checking on neighbors or bringing supplies, could have protected myself with the walls I had built so carefully over the years. But looking into her eyes, I found I did not want walls anymore. I did not want protection. I wanted something real. even if it meant risking everything. Because I want to be here, I did, honestly. Because when I am away from this valley, all I can think about is coming back. Because you make me feel like I am actually alive for the first time since my parents died. I took a shaky breath. Because I think I am falling for you, Laya. And it terrifies me. And I do not know what to do about it. She was quiet for a long moment. So quiet that I started to panic. Started to think I had ruined everything by speaking too soon, feeling too much, wanting more than I had any right to want. Then she reached out and took my hand in hers. Her fingers were warm despite the cold water still dripping from her feet. Strong and gentle at the same time. I am scared too, she admitted. My people and your people have so much bad blood between them, so much pain, so many reasons why this should not work. But when I look at you, I do not see a white man or an enemy or a threat. I see Cole, just Cole, a good man with kind eyes and a lonely heart that matches my own. She squeezed my fingers gently. I want this too, she continued. I want to know where this goes. I want to see if maybe there is a future for us somewhere beyond all the fear and hatred. I could not breathe, could barely think. My heart was pounding so hard it was a wonder she could not hear it echoing off the rocks. Laya, I managed to say. May I? Is it all right if I? She answered by leaning forward and pressing her lips to mine. The kiss was gentle at first, soft as a falling leaf, warm as the first ray of sunlight after a long winter. I felt years of loneliness begin to melt under that single perfect touch. All the walls I had built came crumbling down, brick by brick, until there was nothing left but Cole. Just Cole. Just a man who wanted to love and be loved. When we finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, I rested my forehead against hers. Our breath mingled in the cool evening air. Laya, I started to say, wanting to tell her everything I was feeling, everything I was hoping, everything I was afraid of losing. She placed a finger gently over my lips. No need for more words, she whispered. I know. I feel it too. We sat there by the creek until the stars came out, holding hands and watching the sky fill with pinpricks of ancient light. Ta found us eventually and made a show of rolling her eyes and muttering about young fools, but there was warmth beneath her gruff words. Approval she would never admit to out loud. That night, riding home to my ranch under a blanket of stars, I felt like a different man than the one who had woken up that morning. The lonely rancher who had survived for 5 years on nothing but stubbornness was gone. In his place was someone new, someone who had found a reason to really live. The weeks that followed were the happiest of my entire life. Leia and I stole moments together whenever we could. Walks by the creek, evenings by the fire, conversations that stretched long into the night about everything and nothing at all. We were not husband and wife, not officially, not by any paper that any town in Wyoming would recognize or respect. Our relationship was not something that polite society would approve of or even acknowledge as valid. But it was real. It was true. It was the most honest thing I had ever been part of. And for a while, that was enough. Summer settled over the land like a warm blanket, bringing long days and gentle nights. My ranch was thriving better than it had in years. Calves were born healthy and strong. The creek stayed high, even through the hottest days. For the first time since my parents died, I looked at my 200 acres and saw possibility instead of just hard work. But peace in the West never lasted long. I should have known better than to let my guard down. The first sign of trouble came from town. I had ridden in for supplies one bright July morning, my list tucked in my pocket and a smile on my face that I could not seem to get rid of lately. Old Mrs. Patterson at the general store noticed right away. You are looking well, Cole, she said as she measured out my flour. Got some color in your cheeks. Spring must have agreed with you. It did, I agreed, thinking of Leia and trying not to grin like a fool. But then I noticed the other folks in the store had gone quiet. Too quiet. They were watching me with strange expressions. Curious, suspicious, some of them outright hostile. Jim Price's boy Billy was standing by the pickle barrel with 2 of his friends. They were whispering to each other and glancing my way with ugly smirks on their young faces. Something twisted in my gut, a warning I should have paid more attention to. Outside, I loaded my supplies onto my pack horse and was about to mount up when a hand grabbed my shoulder, and spun me around. Davis Cobb. His face was flush red with summer heat and what looked like cheap whiskey. His breath stank when he got close. Heard some interesting rumors about you, Harding, he slurred. Folks are saying you have been spending a lot of time out near the old canyon, visiting someone. Someone who ain't exactly welcome in these parts. I shook off his hand, trying to keep my voice steady. My business is my own. Has nothing to do with you. It has to do with all of us, he snarled. You think we want savages living on our doorstep? You think we want some squaw lover mixing his blood with theirs and making half-breed babies that will grow up to cause trouble? The words hit me like physical blows. My hands curled into fists at my sides. Every instinct screamed at me to punch that mean smile right off his face. But I knew that was exactly what he wanted. A reason to escalate. A justification for violence. You are drunk, I said flatly. Go home and sleep it off. We have nothing to talk about. I turned my back on him and mounted Willow, riding out of town without looking back. But I could feel his hateful stare burning into me the whole way. That night, I told Leia and Ta what had happened. We sat around their fire, the flames casting dancing shadows on the teepee walls. They will come eventually, Ta said grimly. Men like that always do. They cannot stand seeing others live free when they themselves are so full of fear and hate. Then we should leave, Leia said, her hand finding mine in the firelight. Move further into the mountains. Find somewhere they will never find us. No, the word came out sharper than I intended. I will not be driven off my land, and I will not let them drive you away either. We have just as much right to be here as they do. Ta studied me with her piercing dark eyes. You sound like a warrior, she observed. But warriors need to pick their battles. Sometimes retreating is wiser than fighting. And sometimes standing your ground is the only thing that matters, I replied. A heavy silence fell over our small circle. The fire crackled and popped. An owl called somewhere in the darkness beyond the teepee walls. Finally, Ta nodded slowly. Then we stand together, all three of us, whatever comes. Leia squeezed my hand tight, her eyes bright with emotion. The trouble came faster than any of us expected. 3 days later, I was out mending fences on the far edge of my property when I heard gunshots echoing across the valley. Multiple shots. Too many to be hunters bringing down a deer. My blood went cold. I leaped onto Willow and rode harder than I had ever ridden in my life, pushing her until her sides were heaving and foam flecked her mouth. The gunshots continued, punctuated by shouts and screams that made my heart clench with terror. When I reached the sisters' camp, my worst fears were confirmed. Leia and Ta were crouched behind rocks at the edge of their valley, rifles drawn and ready. 3 mounted men faced them from the open ground, weapons raised, horses pawing nervously at the tense air. Davis Cobb sat in the middle of them, a cruel smile on his face. There he is, Davis called out when he spotted me riding in. The squaw lover himself. Come to save your little Indian princess. I pulled Willow to a stop between the riders and the women, placing myself directly in the line of fire. My hand went to the rifle on my saddle, but I did not draw it. Not yet. This is not your land, Davis, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. You have no right to be here. No authority. This is harassment and intimidation, and it stops right now. Davis laughed, an ugly sound. Authority? I got all the authority I need right here. He patted the pistol on his hip. 3 good men and 3 good guns. What do you got? A couple of squaws with hunting rifles and a fool who forgot what side he is supposed to be on. I got the truth on my side, I replied. And the law, if you want to bring that into it. Sheriff Randall already warned you once. You really want to try this again? Randall ain't here, Davis sneered. Rode out to the Martinez place this morning. Will not be back until nightfall at the earliest. Plenty of time for us to have our fun and be long gone before anyone knows different. Fear shot through me, ice cold and paralyzing. He was right. Help was hours away. We were completely on our own. The man to Davis's left shifted in his saddle, his hand moving toward his rifle. The tension stretched so tight I could barely breathe. Then Ta's voice cut through the standoff, calm and certain. You shoot him, I shoot you. Her rifle was aimed directly at Davis's chest, rock steady. Same moment, maybe you kill him, but you die too. Certain. No question. Davis's confident smile flickered. Just for a second. just long enough to show the fear underneath. Worth it? Ta asked coolly. Killing a rancher for bothering two women who just want to live in peace? Worth dying for? The seconds stretched into eternity. Sweat trickled down my back despite the cool mountain air. Then Davis spat into the dirt and yanked his horse's head around. "This is not over," he growled. "Not by a long shot. You made enemies today, Harding. Enemies who do not forget." He rode off with his companions following close behind, leaving nothing but dust and threats in their wake. When they had finally disappeared over the ridge, I let out a breath I did not know I had been holding. My hands were shaking, my whole body trembling with the aftermath of terror. Leia rushed to my side, her hands cupping my face, checking for injuries that were not there. "You came," she breathed. "You put yourself between us and them. Always," I promised her. "Always." Ta lowered her rifle, her expression unreadable. "Next time they might not back down. We need to be ready." She was right. The storm was coming. And this time, I was not sure shelter would be enough. The days following the confrontation were tense and watchful. I moved what supplies I could to the sisters' camp, including extra ammunition and preserved food. Ta set snares in a wide perimeter around their valley, not to catch game, but to give warning if anyone approached. Leia kept their fire small during the day, using dry wood that made less smoke. We were preparing for war. None of us wanted to admit it out loud, but we all knew what was coming. I spent my nights at my ranch, keeping up appearances, making sure the cattle were tended and the property looked occupied. But my heart was always in the hidden valley with the two women who had become my family. Nearly a week passed with no sign of Davis Cobb or his men. The tension began to ease slightly. Maybe they had given up. Maybe Ta's warning had been enough to scare them off for good. I should have known better. I was splitting firewood behind my barn when I heard hoofbeats approaching fast. Too fast for a casual visit. I grabbed my rifle and moved to a position where I could see the trail from town without being seen myself. Sheriff Randall came into view, riding hard enough that his horse was lathered. Behind him came two deputies I recognized from town. Their faces were grim with purpose. My stomach dropped. Something was very wrong. "Cole Harding," the sheriff called out as he reined to a stop. "Need to talk to you. Official business." I stepped out from cover, rifle at my side but not threatening. "Sheriff, what brings you all the way out here?" "Davis Cobb filed a complaint in town this morning. Says you have been harboring dangerous criminals on your property. Apache women who escaped from the reservation. Says they threatened him and his men with weapons when they tried to apprehend them legally." The lies were so bold they took my breath away. "Legally?" I managed to say. "They rode onto those women's camp with guns drawn. They were the ones making threats. That ain't how Davis tells it." "Davis is a liar and a coward," I shot back. "He has been trying to run those women off since he first heard about them. Has nothing to do with the law. He just hates Indians and wants an excuse to hurt them." Sheriff Randall sighed heavily, removing his hat and wiping his brow. "I know Davis ain't exactly a model citizen, but the law is the law. If those women really escaped from the reservation, they are federal fugitives. I have a duty to investigate." "They are not fugitives," I said firmly. "They are survivors. Their whole family was forced onto that reservation. Most of them died there from sickness and mistreatment. Leia and Ta escaped before the same thing could happen to them. They have been living peacefully in these hills for 2 years without causing any trouble to anyone." The sheriff studied me for a long moment. His deputies shifted uncomfortably in their saddles. "You care about these women," Randall observed. "More than just neighborly concern." I met his eyes without flinching. "Yes, I do. Leia saved my life during the blizzard last winter. Took me in when she had every reason to leave me out in the snow to die. She is the best person I have ever known. And I am not going to let Davis Cobb or anyone else hurt her. That is a lot of conviction for a man who kept to himself for 5 years. Maybe it is time I started caring about something other than just surviving." Another long pause. The tension hung thick in the summer air. Then Sheriff Randall put his hat back on and turned to his deputies. "We did not find anything out here," he said clearly. "No sign of the fugitives Davis described. Must have been mistaken about the location. We will report back to town that the complaint was unfounded." The deputies nodded, looking relieved. They turned their horses and started back toward the trail. Randall lingered for a moment, his eyes meeting mine. I meant what I said before, Cole. You are a good man, better than most in this territory. But you are walking a dangerous path. Folks around here do not take kindly to mixing across the color line. Davis is not going to let this go just because I dismissed his complaint. I know. Watch your back, and tell those women to do the same. Storm is coming. I can feel it. He rode off, leaving me alone with my racing thoughts. That night, I told Leia and Ta what had happened. We sat close together in the darkness of their teepee, speaking in whispers, even though there was no one nearby to hear. The sheriff is on our side for now, I said, but Davis will try something else. He is not the type to give up when he has been embarrassed. We should leave, Leia said. Disappear into the mountains before he can gather more men. Ta shook her head firmly. Running means always running, never stopping, never putting down roots. I am tired of running. I want to stay. I want to fight if we have to. I took Leia's hand in mine, feeling the rapid pulse in her wrist. I am not letting you go, I said. Not now. Not when I just found you. We stand together. Whatever comes, we face it as a family. Family. The word hung in the air between us, heavy with meaning. Leia's eyes glistened in the firelight. Family, she repeated softly. Yes, that is what we are. Ta reached out and placed her hand over both of ours. 3 people who had all lost everything they loved. 3 survivors who had found each other against all odds. Then we prepare, Ta said grimly, and we wait. And if they come for us, we make them regret it. The summer stretched on, hot and tense. I worked my ranch during the days and spent my evenings with Leia and Ta. We practiced shooting together, all 3 of us becoming more accurate, more confident. We fortified their camp with better sight lines and escape routes. We made plans for every scenario we could imagine. August came, bringing heat that made tempers in town even shorter. I heard rumors in the general store that Davis was gathering men, promising money and glory to anyone who would help him rid the territory of the savage threat on their doorstep. Most folks ignored him. They had better things to do than chase shadows in the hills. But a few listened. A few nodded along with his hateful speeches at the saloon. The storm the sheriff warned me about was brewing on the horizon, and when it finally broke, it would change everything. The attack came on a quiet September morning when the leaves were just beginning to turn gold and red on the aspens. I had stayed the night at Leia's camp, something I had been doing more often as the tension grew. We were sitting by the fire sharing a simple breakfast when Ta's alarm snare triggered somewhere in the trees above us. Someone was coming, someone who did not want to be seen. We moved without speaking, each of us knowing exactly what to do. Leia grabbed her rifle and positioned herself behind a large boulder that gave cover and a clearer view of the main approach. Ta climbed to her usual perch on the rocks above, where she could see anyone coming from any direction. I crouched behind a fallen log near the creek, my weapon ready. The waiting was the worst part. Minutes stretched like hours. My heart pounded so loud I was sure it would give away my position. Then they came. Davis Cobb rode at the front of a group of 7 mounted men. Some I recognized from town. Others were strangers, probably hired guns brought in from elsewhere. They had torches in their hands even though it was broad daylight. They had ropes coiled on their saddles. This was not just harassment. This was a lynching party. "Come on out," Davis shouted, his voice echoing off the rocks. "We know you are in there. Make this easy on yourselves." No one moved. No one answered. Davis's face twisted with anger. He nodded to one of his men, who dismounted and started pouring oil from a flask onto the base of a large pine tree. "We will burn you out if we have to," Davis called. "These hills will go up like kindling. Nowhere for you to run." I knew I could not let that happen. A wildfire would destroy not just this camp, but thousands of acres of forest. Hundreds of animals would die. Maybe people too if the wind shifted toward town. I stood up from my hiding spot, rifle aimed at Davis's chest. "That is enough," I said, my voice carrying clear across the valley. Every head turned toward me. Davis smiled a slow, cruel smile. "Cole Harding, figured you would be here with your little friends. Boys, we got ourselves a full house today, 1 traitor and 2 savages, just like I promised. You are making a mistake, Davis. Sheriff Randall knows what you have been planning. He will see you hang for this." "Sheriff is not here," Davis replied. And by the time he finds out what happened, we will be long gone, and you will all be nothing but ash." He raised his hand, ready to give the signal. The shot came from above, so fast I barely registered it. The man with the oil flask screamed and dropped his burden, clutching his arm where Ta's bullet had torn through the muscle. "Next one goes through your skull," Ta called down from her perch. "All of you!" Chaos erupted. Horses reared and screamed. Men shouted confused orders at each other. Davis tried to rally them, but panic was spreading faster than he could control. Then, impossibly, more riders appeared on the ridge behind the mob. Sheriff Randall, his two deputies, and behind them, nearly a dozen townspeople I recognized, led by Jim Price and Mrs. Patterson from the general store. "That is as far as it goes, Davis," the sheriff called out. "Drop your weapons, all of you. Now." Davis's face went pale with shock and fury. "This ain't your business, Randall. These are dangerous criminals, and we have every right to." "You have no rights here," the sheriff cut him off. "What I see is 7 armed men threatening a peaceful homestead. That is not justice. That is attempted murder. And every single one of you is under arrest." For a terrible moment, I thought Davis might try to fight anyway. His hand hovered near his pistol. His eyes darted around, calculating odds, looking for escape. Then Jim Price rode forward, his own weapon drawn. "It is over, Davis. You lost. Accept it like a man for once in your miserable life." The fight went out of Davis like air from a punctured balloon. His shoulders slumped. His hand dropped away from his gun. The arrest was quick and efficient. The sheriff and his deputies secured all 7 men, tying their hands and leading their horses into a line for the march back to town. Before he rode off, Sheriff Randall stopped beside me. "Mrs. Patterson came to my office last night," he explained. "Said she had heard Davis bragging at the saloon about what he was planning. Gathered up some folks who felt the same way I do about lynching mobs. Figured we would ride out and make sure nothing happened." I could barely speak around the lump in my throat. "Thank you, Sheriff. I do not know how to repay you. Just keep being a good man, Cole. The territory needs more people like you and fewer like Davis Cobb." He tipped his hat and rode off, taking the prisoners with him. When they were gone, Leia emerged from behind her boulder and ran into my arms. She was shaking, tears streaming down her face, but she was smiling too. "It is over," she breathed against my chest. "We are safe." Ta climbed down from her perch and stood beside us. Her usual stern expression softened with relief. "Today was a good day," she observed. "Not many days in my life have been good, but today was." I pulled her into the embrace with Leia and me, holding both sisters tight. "We made it," I said, "all of us, together." Autumn settled over the Wyoming territory in a blaze of gold and crimson. The aspens along the creek turned bright yellow, their leaves catching the light like scattered coins. The air grew crisp with the promise of winter, but this year the cold did not frighten me. This year I had warmth to come home to. Davis Cobb and his men were tried and convicted within a month. The judge sentenced them to 10 years of hard labor for attempted murder and conspiracy. As they were led away in chains, I felt something I had not expected. Not satisfaction or revenge, but simply relief. The darkness that had threatened to swallow us was gone. The townspeople who had ridden out to help us that morning became unlikely allies. Mrs. Patterson stopped by my ranch regularly with Pies news from town. Jim Price offered to help me expand my cattle operation come spring. Even Billy, his son, started nodding politely when he saw me on the street instead of looking away. Change was slow. Not everyone in town approved of my relationship with Leia. Some folks still whispered when I walked by. Some still refused to serve me at certain establishments. But the hatred was no longer as bold as it had been. The darkness had been pushed back, at least a little. One night in late October, as the first snowflakes of the season began to fall, Leia led me down to the creek by their camp. The water was silver in the moonlight, stars scattered across the sky like diamonds on black velvet. "Cole," she said softly, taking both my hands in hers, "there is something I want to ask you." My heart started beating faster. "Anything." "Our people have a tradition. When 2 people decide to bind their lives together, they do not need a church or a priest or papers from a government that does not recognize them anyway. They speak their vows before the fire, before the stars, before the spirits of their ancestors. Only their hearts matter, only their promise to each other. She looked up at me, her dark eyes shining with emotion. Will you take those vows with me, Cole? Will you become my husband in the way of my people? I could barely breathe. Every hope I had ever buried, every dream I had given up on, every lonely night spent thinking I would die alone on my ranch, all of it melted away in the face of this one perfect moment. Yes, I whispered. Yes, 1,000 times yes. Ta appeared from the shadows, a torch in her hand and a rare smile on her face. About time, she said gruffly. I was starting to think he would never ask. Leia laughed, a sound like water over stones, and led me back to the camp where a fire was already burning bright. We stood before the flames, hands clasped, while Ta served as our witness. The snow fell gently around us, white and pure, transforming the world into something magical. Leia spoke first, her voice clear and strong. Where your heart goes, mine follows. Where you seek shelter, I stand beside you. Where winter finds us, we fight it together. I choose you, Cole Harding. Today and all the days after, my throat was so tight I could barely speak. But I forced the words out, meaning every single one. Where your heart goes, mine follows. Where you seek shelter, I stand beside you. Where winter finds us, we fight it together. I choose you, Leia, today and all the days after. We sealed our vows with a kiss, long and deep and full of promise. Ta wiped her eyes quickly, pretending it was smoke irritation. Family does not always come from blood, she said, repeating the words she had spoken once before. Sometimes it comes from storms. She embraced us both, and for the first time since I had known her, she let herself be soft. The fire crackled, the snow continued to fall, and somewhere in the darkness, an owl called out into the night. I was no longer the loneliest man in Wyoming. I was a husband, a brother, a man with a family who loved him and a future worth fighting for. The storm that had nearly killed me all those months ago had delivered me to the two people who would save me. Not just my life, but my soul. And as I held Leia in my arms beneath the falling snow, I made a silent promise to whatever spirits might be listening. I would spend the rest of my days worthy of this love, worthy of this family, worthy of the second chance I had been given. Some people search their whole lives for a place to belong. I found mine in a hidden valley, in the arms of an Apache woman, in a family forged by snow and fire and courage, and I was never letting go.